The last thing I remember before the floor came up to meet me was the sound of my own name. Arthur Mitchell. 3,000 people. A packed gymnasium that smelled like folding chairs, cheap cologne, and decades of ambition baked into institutional carpet. The dean's voice was warm, practiced, the kind of voice that had announced 1,000 names before mine and would announce 1,000 more after. I heard it like it was coming from underwater. I had been standing in that line for 40 minutes. Dress shoes I'd bought secondhand from a Goodwill on Route 9. Gown that didn't quite fit across the shoulders because I'd lost 11 pounds in the last 2 months. Not from discipline, but from hunger dressed up as discipline. My chest had been doing that thing again. That tight, squeezing thing, like a fist wrapped around my sternum and slowly closing. I told myself, just get to the stage. Just get to the stage and everything else can fall apart later. I made it to the bottom of the stairs. Then my legs decided they were done. I don't remember hitting the microphone stand. Someone told me later I took it clean off the base. I don't remember the gasps from the crowd, or the dean stepping back, or the 2 faculty members who ran toward me. I don't remember any of it. What I do remember is waking up. White ceiling. The particular blue-white of fluorescent lights that exist only in hospitals and interrogation rooms. A steady, mechanical beeping that I would come to hate with every fiber of my being over the next 72 hours. The smell of antiseptic and something faintly metallic. Cold air on my forearms where my sleeves had been rolled back for an 4-line. And a hand. Small. Dry. Papery the way old hands get when the skin has had 81 years to grow thin. Holding mine with a grip that was surprisingly firm for someone who weighed less than 110 pounds. I turned my head. Grandma Martha was sitting in the chair beside my bed, wearing her good navy cardigan, the one she saved for church and doctor's appointments, with a manila envelope on her lap. She hadn't been to sleep. I could tell by the shadows under her eyes and the way she sat completely still, the way people sit still when they've been sitting still for a very long time and have made peace with it. She looked at me and said quietly, "There he is." That was all. I tried to speak. My throat felt like dry gravel. I managed, "What happened?" "Your heart decided it had been working without adequate support for long enough," she said. "The doctors have a more technical name for it. But that's what happened." I closed my eyes, opened them again. The ceiling was still there. The beeping was still there. How long? 3 days. 3 days. I let that sit for a moment. "Mom and Dad are not here." Her voice didn't change. No apology in it, no softening. Just the flat, clean truth of it, delivered the way she'd always delivered hard things. Like a woman who had lived long enough to know that coating the truth in sugar didn't make it less true. I stared at the ceiling. The nurse came in about 10 minutes later. Young woman, maybe 25, clipboard in hand, the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times. She explained what the doctors had found. An arrhythmia that had been building for months, stress compounded, exacerbated by exhaustion and, she paused, reading from the chart, inadequate nutrition and a documented lapse in cardiac medication. She told me the hospital had placed 45 calls to my listed emergency contacts over the first 3 hours after I was admitted. 45. Every call went to voicemail, she said. She moved on to discharge paperwork details. Professional. Kind. Not her fault. I lay there and said nothing. Outside the window, the October sky was the color of old pewter. Somewhere across town, my graduation ceremony had finished without me. Somewhere considerably farther, about 2,000 miles farther, give or take, my family had not picked up the phone. Grandma Martha squeezed my hand once. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. "Let me take you back 5 weeks because you need to understand what I was running on. Not money, not support, not anything that most people would recognize as a foundation. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I am not telling you this to ask for sympathy. I've never been good at that, and I'm not starting now. I'm telling you this because the facts matter. The facts are what make everything that came later make sense." I was working 3 jobs. The first was construction labor. Day shifts, 5 days a week, starting at 6:15 in the morning. Mixing concrete, hauling drywall, doing whatever the foreman pointed at. It paid $17.50 an hour, which sounds reasonable until you factor in the steel-toed boots I'd bought on credit, the gas to get there, and the fact that my body was trying to run an engineering degree at the same time. The second job was at a building supply store out on the highway evenings, 3 nights a week. Helping contractors load lumber, answering questions about fasteners and adhesives, keeping the yard organized. Another $12 an hour. The manager was a decent man named Dale who never asked me why I looked so tired, which I appreciated more than he knew. The third job was overnight security. Weekends. Sitting in a booth outside a pharmaceutical warehouse from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., watching a mostly empty parking lot while trying to study. I kept a thermos of black coffee and a legal pad full of structural load calculations on the counter beside me. I was sleeping, on average, 4 hours a night. I was eating, on average, and I mean this literally, 1 real meal per day. Grocery outlet bread that was 2 days from the markdown date. Instant ramen, the 25-cent kind. On good weeks, a rotisserie chicken from the discount rack at closing time. I kept a running list in my phone of which stores marked down their bakery items on which days. I knew that the Kroger on Jefferson marked down their day-old bagels every Tuesday at 5 p.m. I knew the Walmart on Route 12 cut their deli meat prices on Thursday evenings. I knew these things the way men know things they've had to learn out of necessity rather than curiosity. I was 5 weeks from graduation, from a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering, with a 3.87 GPA, graduating first in my department. I had already passed 2 of my professional licensure exams. I had a job offer from a mid-size infrastructure firm in Denver waiting on my signature. I just needed to get across the finish line. Then my laptop died. Not dramatically. No spark, no smoke. It just stopped working one afternoon in the campus library. The motherboard, the repair tech told me. He quoted me $450 to fix it. Not for a new laptop, to fix the one I had. $450. I had $312 in my checking account. I had $2,500 in a savings account that my mother had helped me open when I was 16, back when she still occasionally played the role of a parent who cared about practical things. The account was joint, because I'd been 16 and hadn't thought about what that meant. I called my father, Richard Mitchell, commercial real estate developer, a man who had, as recently as that summer, written a $95,000 check toward my brother Julian's wedding without blinking. A man who drove a vehicle that cost more than most people's annual salary. A man who had, when I was 12, told me that a Mitchell never asks for help because Mitchells are the ones other people ask. He answered on the third ring. Arthur. Not a greeting. A data point. Dad, I need to borrow $450. My laptop died and I need it to finish my capstone drawings. I'll pay you back the first month after I start working. The budget's tight right now, Arthur. Same tone he used in business meetings. Flat. Final. You know things are stretched with the wedding coming up. You need to learn to manage your own finances. I stood in the parking lot of the library and listened to those words. Then I heard the front door of the house open behind him, through the phone. And I heard Julian's voice. Dad, check this out. Just picked it up. The sound of something being set on the counter. My father's tone changed entirely, the way a man's voice changes when he turns toward someone he actually wants to talk to. What is that? Chronograph. Designer piece. Had it custom matched to the suit. The tailor said the dial color was, how much? $1,400. Worth every dollar though, right? A pause. The small, familiar sound of a card being slid across a counter. Absolutely, my father said. Good eye. I stood in that parking lot for a long moment. The air smelled like exhaust and cut grass. A truck went by on the road behind me, radio playing something country, fading out as it passed. I hung up without saying goodbye. I sold my truck 4 days later. A 2004 F-150 with 190,000 miles on it, that I'd bought for $2,800 3 years ago and kept running through YouTube tutorials and Sunday afternoons. I got $1,600 for it. I paid $450 to fix the laptop, bought 3 months of transit passes, and put the rest toward tuition and rent. My father bought a $1,400 watch for my brother the same afternoon. He told me he couldn't lend me $450. I want you to remember that number. $1,400. Comes back later. For weeks before graduation, I put 3 tickets on the dining room table. VIP seating. Commencement ceremony. Mitchell University Fieldhouse. I'd gone to the registrar's office myself to request them, which required filling out a form and waiting 2 weeks. I had pressed them into a white envelope with the ceremony date written on the outside in my own handwriting. I told myself on the walk home from the registrar's office that I was not doing this to ask for anything. I was doing it because it was a significant thing, and significant things deserve to be acknowledged. I had graduated first in my department. I had done it while working 3 jobs and eating discount bread. If that wasn't worth a folding chair in a gymnasium, I didn't know what was. My mother was in the kitchen when I set the envelope down. She looked at it the way she looked at most things I brought into the house, with the particular expression of a woman who has already decided what she thinks before she's seen the evidence. "What's this?" she asked. "Graduation tickets. 3 of them. Ceremonies the 15th. She opened the envelope, looked at the tickets, set them back down on the table like she was returning something mildly distasteful. "Arthur." She pulled out her reading glasses, though she didn't need them. It was a gesture she used when she wanted to seem measured. "You know we already made plans." "What plans?" "The trip to Cabo. For Julian's bachelor party." She folded her hands. "Your father booked the charter weeks ago. It was the only window before the rehearsal dinners start." I waited. "We can watch the live stream," she added. "They post those online now, don't they?" I looked at her for a long moment. Beatrice Mitchell, née Carroll. A woman who had grown up poor in a way she never talked about but never forgot. You could see it in the way she held her silverware, too deliberately, the way she overpronounced certain words when she was around people she wanted to impress. She had married my father for reasons that had calcified over the decades into a kind of social project. The Mitchell name, the Mitchell address, the Mitchell son, meaning Julian, who was marrying into a family with political connections and a beach house in the Hamptons. I was not that project. I had never been that project. "It's a civil engineering degree," she continued, when I didn't respond. "First in the department, you said, that's fine, Arthur, but that kind of thing doesn't open doors the way connections do. Julian's marriage is going to elevate this entire family. That's where we need to be focused right now." I picked up the 3 tickets, put 2 of them back in the envelope. "I'll give the other 2 to friends," I said. I kept 1 ticket on the table. I went upstairs. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the small sound from the living room, the creak of the wingback chair by the window, the one my grandmother claimed as her own during her visits. My grandmother, Martha Louise Mitchell, who had been sitting there the entire time, quiet as a lamp, and whom both my mother and I had somehow managed not to address in the preceding 4 minutes. She called my name. I came back down the last 3 steps. She was 81 years old, my grandmother. Small and thin the way certain trees get in old age, not fragile, just reduced to what's essential. She had clear gray eyes that missed very little and a stillness about her that I'd always found more comforting than anything that moved. She reached out and took my hand. "Sit," she said. I sat on the arm of the couch beside her chair. She looked at me for a moment, studying me the way she'd studied crossword puzzles when I was a kid, like there was a correct answer and she was working out the approach. Then she said quietly, "Intelligence doesn't buy you a club membership, Arthur, but it buys you freedom." I didn't say anything. "Keep doing what you're doing," she said. "Get your degree. Walk that stage. I will be in the front row." She squeezed my hand once, firmly, the way you shake a hand when you mean a promise. "And I'll tell you this, I've made certain arrangements. When the time comes, this story is going to have quite an ending." I didn't know what she meant. I thought she was just being kind. Grandmothers say things like that. I was wrong, but I wouldn't find out how wrong for another 4 weeks. 3 weeks before graduation, my heart started seriously trying to get my attention. I'd been ignoring the chest tightness for months. I am not proud of that. I am a man who can read a structural load diagram, calculate shear force on a beam, tell you exactly what happens to a bridge when the dynamic load exceeds design tolerances. I knew intellectually that the human heart is not unlike an infrastructure system. Overload it long enough without maintenance and something fails. I knew this. I kept ignoring it anyway, because I couldn't afford to stop. A cardiologist at the Student Health Center, a quiet, serious woman named Dr. Ewan who wore her reading glasses on a chain around her neck and had the kind of measured delivery that told you she didn't believe in softening the math, reviewed my EKG and sat back in her chair and looked at me. "You have a ventricular arrhythmia," she said. "It's been there for a while based on these readings. The good news is it's manageable. The bad news is the management is not optional." She prescribed 2 medications. Both of them name-brand at the pharmacy because the generics weren't available for one of them. The total came to $214 a month. I thanked her and went to the pharmacy. I handed the cashier my debit card. She ran it. She looked at her screen. She ran it again. "It's coming back declined," she said. Not unkindly. She'd seen this before. I checked my banking app on my phone. My checking account, $48.62. That was expected. Payday wasn't until Friday. My savings account, $0. I stood at the pharmacy counter and stared at that number. 0. I had $2,500 in that account 3 days ago. I knew the number precisely because I'd been tracking it the way you track your water supply when you're not sure of the next source. I hadn't touched it. I'd been saving it for exactly this kind of emergency. I stepped away from the counter. I called the bank. They walked me through the transaction history. A withdrawal of $2,500, made in person with a valid cosigner signature, 48 hours ago. There was only one other name on that account. I called my father. He answered on the second ring, which told me he wasn't expecting the conversation to be difficult. "Arthur." "Dad." "My savings account." I kept my voice level. I had learned, by that point in my life, that keeping my voice level was the only advantage I reliably had in conversations with my father. "It's empty." A brief pause. Not the pause of a man caught off guard. The pause of a man deciding how much explanation was warranted. "I borrowed it," he said. "Temporarily. The deposit for the yacht charter in Cabo. They moved up the due date and the card I had on file was tied up in an escrow hold for the Hendricks development. It was the most convenient option." I listened to that sentence very carefully. Convenient. "That was my medication money," I said. "I just tried to pick up a cardiac prescription." The card was declined. Another pause. Shorter this time. "You're 23 years old, Arthur. Healthy young men work through discomfort. I'll have it back to you next month, after the Cabo trip." "Dad." "It's heart medication." The doctor said. "I heard you." His voice had the same quality it got when a business negotiation was wrapping up. Measured, dismissive, done. "You're resourceful. You'll figure it out. That's always been your strength, right?" He hung up. I stood on the sidewalk outside the pharmacy. It was 52 degrees and the wind was pushing dead leaves across the parking lot in small, indifferent circles. I could feel my heart doing that thing again, that slight, a rhythmic skip like a drummer losing the beat for half a second. My father had taken $2,500 from a savings account I'd built over 7 years of weekend jobs, lawn mowing, holiday work at the UPS distribution center, Christmas shifts at Best Buy, money I had accumulated dollar by dollar starting at 16 years old, so that he could pay a deposit on a yacht charter for my brother's bachelor party. He had done it without asking. He had done it knowing about the arrhythmia, because I had told my mother about the diagnosis 10 days earlier. He had called me resourceful. I stood there for a long time. Then I called Dale, my manager at the building supply store, and asked if I could pick up an extra shift. He said yes. I worked that Friday, got paid, bought the cheaper of the 2 medications, the one that had a generic available, and rationed the dosage the way people ration things when they have no other choice. I told nobody. I just kept working. But something had changed in me that afternoon outside the pharmacy. Something quiet and permanent, the way a structural crack is quiet, invisible on the surface, already doing its work underneath. I thought about my grandmother's words. "This story is going to have quite an ending." I didn't understand yet what she had done. I didn't understand what the manila envelope on her lap in the ICU contained. I didn't understand why she'd said it with that particular stillness. The stillness of a woman who has already moved all the pieces into position and is simply waiting for the board to clear. I would understand soon enough. 2 weeks before graduation, Julian sent me a text. My brother Julian, 26 years old. A man who had never held a job for longer than 8 months, who described his occupation on his social media profiles as entrepreneur and visionary without apparent irony, and who was 3 weeks from marrying the daughter of a state senator from Connecticut. He had my mother's taste for status and my father's facility with using other people's resources without acknowledgement. The text came at 7:42 a.m. on a Tuesday, while I was on a job site, 40 feet up a scaffold with a level in my hand. Need you to drive up to the storage facility in Harrisburg and move the wedding furniture pieces to the venue. This weekend. Truck and labor. Don't book movers, we're keeping costs down. Harrisburg was 300 miles away. I read the text twice. I put my phone back in my pocket. I finished setting the beam I was working on. I climbed back down the scaffold at the end of my shift, sat in the break room, and read it one more time to make sure I'd understood it correctly. Yes, my brother was instructing me to take 2 days off from work, drive 600 miles round trip in a vehicle I no longer owned, to move his wedding furniture for free 10 days before my own graduation, while I was running on 4 hours of sleep, ration heart medication, and the particular brand of exhaustion that doesn't show on your face anymore because it's become your baseline. I typed back. I have my capstone defense that weekend. Also, I sold the truck. 40 minutes passed. Then, get a rental. Dad will cover it. I stared at that. Then my phone rang. My father. Your brother needs you, he said without preamble. This is what families do. Dad, I have my defense on Saturday morning. It's the last requirement before I graduate. I cannot. You cannot. He repeated the words slowly, with a kind of dangerous flatness. That's what you're saying to me. I'm saying I have a prior obligation. The most important academic deadline of my life. Let me be clear about something, Arthur. His voice had that quality now, the one that meant the negotiation was over and he was handing down a ruling. If you can't make yourself useful to this family, then I have no obligation to maintain responsibility for you. You haven't maintained any responsibility for me in. I'll take care of it, he said. He hung up. 30 minutes later, I received an email from my father's HR department. I was still listed as a dependent on his employer health plan, a provision he'd maintained because it cost him nothing. The email informed me that my coverage had been terminated effective immediately. Per the plan administrator, a primary subscriber can remove dependents at any time. I sat with that email for a long time. I had a diagnosed ventricular arrhythmia. I was rationing my cardiac medication because my father had stolen my savings to fund a yacht trip. And now he had pulled my health insurance. 10 days before the physical stress of graduation and the final push of 3 concurrent jobs was scheduled to peak. I did not call him back. There was nothing to say. I called Grandma Martha instead. She answered on the first ring, which surprised me. She usually let unknown numbers go. But she knew it was me. She always seemed to know. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the job site, and I told her everything. The arrhythmia, the medication, the $2,500, the insurance. My voice stayed level until the very end, and then it didn't, just for about 4 seconds, and I hated those 4 seconds, but they happened. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then she said, Arthur, I need you to do one thing. What? Get yourself to that stage on the 15th. Whatever it costs you physically to get there, you get there. You walk up, you accept that degree, and you look for me in the front row. Grandma, I'll cover the medications. I'm calling the pharmacy today. I want you to hear me carefully now. A pause. Everything your grandfather and I built, everything that was supposed to provide for this family, there are structures in place that your father never bothered to read the fine print on. He assumed. People like your father always assume. Another pause. The 15th, she said. Front row. Don't be late. She hung up. I sat in the parking lot and breathed. My chest was tight. My hands were gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. Outside, two guys from the job site were walking to their truck, laughing about something, their voices fading. I thought about fine print. I thought about assumptions. I thought about my grandmother at 81 years old, holding a manila envelope, sitting very still in a front row seat at a graduation ceremony with the quiet patience of someone who had already decided exactly how this was going to end. The morning of the 15th, I received a photograph at 7:22 a.m. It came from my brother's Instagram story, screenshot and sent to my phone by a girl I'd gone to high school with who thought I'd want to see it. Julian and my parents in matching resort wear. My father in a linen shirt, my mother in a white sundress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Raising champagne flutes in what appeared to be the first-class cabin of a commercial flight. Below Julian's face, a caption, "Living the Cabo life. Leaving the L's back home." I stared at that photograph for exactly the length of time it took me to walk from my apartment door to my car. Then I put my phone face down on the passenger seat and drove to campus. The morning was cold. A real October cold, the kind that doesn't have any warmth hiding underneath it. Not transitional cold, the thing itself. My breath showed in the air when I stepped out of the borrowed car I'd gotten from a friend. I straightened my gown in the side mirror, adjusted the hood, and walked toward the gymnasium. My chest was doing the thing. I knew it the moment I got in line with the other graduates. A tightness that wasn't anxiety, though there was plenty of that too, but something more specific, more physical. Pressure. The kind that starts between your shoulder blades and radiates forward, and that Dr. Ewan had described to me very precisely as a warning indicator. I told myself, 1 hour. This takes 1 hour and then it is done and you never have to stand in this particular line again. The procession started. We moved in the careful, slightly absurd way graduation processions move. Measured, formal, wholly disconnected from how any of us actually walked in real life. I focused on the back of the head of the woman in front of me. I counted my steps. I breathed through my nose and out through my mouth, the way Dr. Ewan had taught me. The gymnasium was warm. 3,000 people generate heat, that specific, dense human warmth that settles at shoulder level and doesn't move. The lights above the stage were brighter than the rest of the room, and when I looked out from the seats toward the stage, I saw the front row of reserved VIP seating. I found her immediately. She was wearing her navy cardigan. She had gotten there early enough to get exactly the seat she wanted, center front, which on my grandmother required a level of logistical planning that I fully believe she had executed the night before with a hand-drawn seating diagram. She had a manila envelope on her lap, both hands resting on top of it, perfectly still. She saw me find her in the crowd. She nodded once. I don't know how to fully explain what that did for me. There are things that cost nothing and hold everything. That nod was one of them. 81 years old, bad knees, drove herself 40 minutes to be in a folding chair in a gymnasium at 8:30 in the morning. In the front row, just like she said. The ceremony started. I sat through the speeches. I registered them the way you register background noise when something else is occupying your full cognitive capacity. My heart was skipping. Not dramatically, not the clutching, stop you in your tracks version. The quieter version. The version I'd learned to work alongside like a sound in the wall you've gotten used to. I told myself, you're almost there. They began calling names. Each row stood when their section was called. I stood with mine. Walking toward the stage, I looked out at the faces in the crowd. Families with phones raised. Fathers with expressions that looked like pride relieved of having to be articulated. Mothers crying the small, controlled cry of people in public. Siblings bored or supportive in roughly equal measure. My row was empty of people who had come for me. Except one. I watched my grandmother track my progress from the seats toward the stage. She had straightened slightly in her chair. Her hands were still on the envelope. Her eyes were steady. Arthur Mitchell. I started up the stairs. The pressure in my chest had become something more specific by then. Not a background condition but a foreground one, something demanding to be addressed. I was aware of my own heartbeat in a way that healthy people usually aren't, each beat slightly out of its expected rhythm, like a drummer rushing the tempo by just enough to make the whole thing feel precarious. 3 steps from the top. My grandmother was coming toward me. Not running. She can't run anymore, hasn't been able to for years. But moving with that deliberate speed of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and why and has cleared everything non-essential out of the way. She had the envelope in one hand, extended slightly, as if she'd timed the transfer of it. As if this moment had been choreographed months in advance. She reached the foot of the stage stairs. I reached the top. The dean extended his hand and the degree cover toward me. I took it, and then my body said, "That's enough." The pressure became pain. Clean, specific, undeniable. The kind of pain that doesn't ask permission or allow negotiation. My legs sent a message that I didn't have the processing capacity to override. The microphone stand was to my left. I didn't mean to hit it. I caught the bass on the way down and it went sideways, and the amplified clang of it hitting the stage was the last thing I clearly heard. That, and 3,000 people drawing breath simultaneously, a sound like the world pulling back before something hits. My grandmother's voice, from somewhere near the floor of the stage, saying my name. Then nothing. 3 days of nothing. Then white ceiling. Blue-white lights. The mechanical beeping of a heart monitor. The smell of antiseptic. And a small, dry hand, holding mine with a grip like a promise that hadn't been broken. "There he is," she said. The manila envelope was still on her lap. She had held onto it through the fall, through the ambulance, through 3 days of my unconsciousness, through 45 unanswered phone calls, through whatever it felt like to sit alone in an ICU waiting room at 81 years old because the people who should have been there were posting champagne photographs over the Pacific. She had kept it on her lap this whole time, because she wasn't finished yet, and neither was I. I was awake for maybe 10 minutes before I picked up my phone. Grandma Martha didn't try to stop me. She just watched with that same stillness, as I reached for it on the bedside table where someone had set it to charge. The screen lit up. 104 missed calls. Not all of them were my parents. 11 were from numbers I didn't recognize, journalists I'd later find out, from the campus paper and 2 local news stations who had filmed the collapse. 12 were from classmates and professors. 4 were from Dale, my manager at the building supply store, who I would later learn had sent flowers to the hospital after hearing what happened. The rest were from Richard and Beatrice Mitchell. I scrolled to the texts. The first message from my mother came in at approximately 2 hours after I'd been admitted. I know the timestamp because I checked. It read, "Arthur, we're hearing something happened at graduation. Please call when you're able." That was the last message that mentioned me. Every single communication after that, and there were 41 of them spread across 3 days, was about money. Our card was declined at the restaurant. Something is wrong with the account. Julian's venue deposit payment bounced. This is a disaster. Arthur, call us now. The florist is saying the check didn't clear. Do you have any idea what you've done? Helena's parents are asking questions. Helena was Julian's fiancée. Helena's father was a man whose name appeared on 3 county commission buildings and who had, according to my mother's entire social strategy for the past 2 years, the power to elevate the Mitchell family into a tier they had been auditioning for since before I was born. "We will lose everything if you don't fix this today. Call." I read every message. I read them the way you read a document you're going to need to reference later, carefully, without letting the content move you, storing it for use. Then I set the phone face down on the blanket. "How long have you known?" I asked. My grandmother didn't pretend not to understand the question. "That your father was spending money he didn't have?" She adjusted the envelope on her lap. "Since the summer your grandfather passed. That was 7 years ago. Your father had his hand in 3 accounts within 40 days of the funeral. He'd convinced himself it was his by inheritance, which tells you something about what he thought of the paperwork he'd never read." I looked at the ceiling. "And you waited." "I waited until the right moment," she said. "There's a difference." The nurse came in at that point to check my vitals. She was the same young woman from the first night, and she gave me a small, genuine smile when she saw my eyes open. She checked the monitor. She wrote things on her clipboard. "Your heart is settling into a better rhythm. she said. The procedure went well. Dr. Ewan wants to do a follow-up on Friday, but the signs are positive. She paused at the door on her way out. Your grandmother refused to leave, she said. 3 days. We offered her the family waiting room twice. She said she was fine where she was. She closed the door. I turned and looked at the woman sitting beside me. 81 years old, in her good navy cardigan, with a manila envelope on her lap and a back that had to be aching from 3 days in a hospital chair. She met my eyes without flinching. The envelope, I said. When you're ready, she said. I pushed myself up slightly against the pillow. The 4-line pulled at my arm. The heart monitor beeped its steady, reliable rhythm, telling the room what my body was doing whether I wanted it to or not. I'm ready, I said. She didn't open it yet. She said, what I'm about to show you was your grandfather's final decision, not mine. I was simply the custodian. Then she opened the envelope. His name was Harold James Mitchell, Korean War veteran, former construction foreman who had built, by his own hands and his own crew, 11 commercial buildings in 3 counties over a 40-year career. A man who had never owned anything he hadn't earned and had kept meticulous records of every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out, because he had grown up in the kind of poverty where imprecision was a luxury you couldn't afford. He died 7 years ago, and I had not fully understood until that afternoon in the ICU just how thoroughly he had seen through the people living in his house. My grandmother walked me through the documents one at a time. The first was a trust instrument. 12 pages, dense with legal language, executed by a probate attorney in 2009, 6 years before Harold died, meaning he had made these decisions when he was clear-headed and deliberate, not in the diminished urgency of illness. The trust established that a significant portion of Harold's assets, cash holdings, investment accounts, and specific real estate holdings, were held in trust for his younger grandson, Arthur James Mitchell, to be administered by Martha Louise Mitchell as sole trustee. The distribution trigger. The date Arthur received his first post-secondary degree. That date was the 15th. The date I had collapsed on the stage. The date my parents were posting champagne photographs on a flight to Cabo. The trust had activated automatically upon verification of my enrollment status with the university, which the attorney's office had confirmed independently. No action required from me. No signature from my parents. No notification to Richard or Beatrice in advance. Harold had specifically excluded them from advance notice. He had written that exclusion into the document by name, with a 1-sentence explanation that my grandmother read to me aloud. Richard has demonstrated a consistent inability to distinguish between his own property and the property of others. 12 words. My grandfather had distilled 20 years of observation into 12 words. The second document was a property deed. The house my parents lived in, the 4-bedroom colonial with the 3-car garage on Sycamore Drive that my mother used as her primary evidence that the Mitchell family had arrived, sat on a parcel of land that Harold had purchased in 1987. The house itself was my parents' construction, built in 2003 with a mortgage my father had taken out against the land. The land, however, had never been transferred. It had remained quietly in Harold's name and then in the trust. My grandmother had sold that parcel, not to the highest bidder, to a commercial development company that had been interested in it for years, for a shopping complex expansion. She had closed the sale 11 days ago. The new owners had a demolition schedule. 30 days for the current occupants to vacate. I sat with that for a long moment. The heart monitor kept its rhythm. Outside the window, the October sky had gone from pewter to the dark blue of early evening. Did they know? I asked. They knew what your grandfather had always told them, she said. That the land was family property. They assumed that meant theirs. She folded her hands over the closed envelope. Your father is a man who reads the summary and skips the footnotes. That habit has consequences. I thought about a $1,400 watch. I thought about 41 text messages about bounce checks. I thought about the word convenient. There's more, she said. Tell me. She told me. They arrived on the 4th day. I heard them before I saw them. The particular quality of my family's entrance had never been subtle. My mother's voice in the hallway, sharp and performance-inflected the way it got when she wanted a specific result from someone with institutional authority. Julian's lower register underneath, the casual arrogance of a man who had never once in his life been in a room where he wasn't treated as significant. My father's footsteps. I knew them. Heavy, deliberate. The walk of a man who believes his arrival matters. The door opened. They were still in vacation clothes. I want you to understand what I mean by that. They had clearly come from the airport more or less directly. My mother was in a resort-style wrap dress, cream-colored with sandals. Julian had on linen trousers and a polo shirt the color of a swimming pool. My father was in his Cabo outfit, light chinos, a half-unbuttoned shirt, the particular deep tan of someone who'd spent 4 days in direct Mexican sun. The smell reached me before anything else. Sunscreen. That specific coconut chemical smell of SPF 50 applied in quantity. In an ICU room, beside a man with cardiac monitoring leads still attached to his chest. I watched my grandmother's face. It didn't change. My mother's eyes moved around the room with the efficiency of someone cataloging a situation for immediate management. They landed on me. They assessed my condition with the speed of a woman deciding whether the optics required her to cry. She decided yes. Arthur. She came to the side of the bed, and the performance of her distress was so well constructed that I almost appreciated the craft of it. Why didn't you tell us it was this serious? We came as soon as we could. The hospital called 45 times, I said. Brief pause. We were in international waters, she said. The service. Mom. My voice was quiet. Don't. She stopped. Julian stood near the door with his hands in his pockets, and he said with a tone of genuine sounding grievance, "You always do this. Every major moment in this family, you find a way to make it about yourself." I looked at him for a long moment. I didn't say anything. There is a specific kind of silence that unsettles people who are used to filling space with words. Julian shifted his weight. He looked away first. My father came to stand at the foot of the bed. He looked at the monitoring equipment with the expression of a man encountering an invoice he'd rather not see. "You're going to be all right," he said. It was not a question or a comfort. It was a directive, a business decision. Be all right because I need you to be all right so we can address the actual situation. "The accounts," he said. "We need to sort out what's happened with the accounts. Julian's venue is threatening to cancel the booking entirely, and Helena's father, Richard," my grandmother's voice. He stopped. She was sitting in her chair with the manila envelope now open across her knees, several documents visible. She was wearing her reading glasses. She looked, in that moment, like a woman chairing a meeting she had organized years in advance. "Sit down," she said. "Mother, this isn't the time for—" I said sit down. He sat. I don't think Richard Mitchell had been told to sit down by another human being in 15 years. The effect was notable. Something went out of his posture, some structural confidence, like a load-bearing wall recognizing a crack. My mother and Julian remained standing but went still. My grandmother removed the first document from the envelope. She set it on the tray table beside my bed, facing outward so the room could see. "Your father-in-law," she said to my mother, meaning Harold, meaning her own late husband, "was a careful man. He was careful in the way that men who build things with their hands tend to be careful. He understood that if you don't account for every load, something eventually fails." She set the second document beside the first. "He saw you clearly, Beatrice. Both of you. He loved his son because Harold was a man who committed to what he started. But he was not confused about what his son had become." She removed her glasses and looked at my father directly. "You've been spending trust money for 7 years, Richard. Not your inheritance. A trust you were never named in. Every disbursement your attorney made to you after Harold passed. And your attorney did make disbursements because he believed the verbal representations you gave him about your standing. Every one of those was drawn against the principle that legally belonged to Arthur." The room was very quiet. The heart monitor kept beeping. Julian opened his mouth, closed it. "The land," my father said. His voice had changed. Something had left it. The house is scheduled for demolition in 26 days, my grandmother said. The parcel sold to Meridian Commercial Development 11 days ago. The transaction is complete and recorded. My mother made a sound I had never heard her make before. Small, involuntary, like the sound a structure makes before it shifts. You have 30 days from the date of sale to remove your belongings, my grandmother said. I'd suggest starting soon. What happened next took 40 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall above the door. One of those standard hospital clocks, black frame, white face, the kind designed to be readable from across a room. I watched it the way you watch something when the alternative is watching people realize that the life they thought they had doesn't exist. My grandmother was methodical. She had the patience of someone who had waited 7 years for this particular meeting and had no intention of rushing it. The third document was a full accounting of the trust assets. Total value, as of the most recent appraisal, net of the disbursements that had been incorrectly redirected to my father. The number was substantial, more than I had understood from our earlier conversation, because my grandmother had said significant and I had not pressed for the figure. I pressed now. She told me. My mother sat down. She found the chair near the window without looking at it, the way people sit when their legs make the decision before their brain catches up. The investment portfolio is already transferred, my grandmother continued. I completed the paperwork with the financial institution 3 weeks ago. It's held under Arthur's name and a limited liability structure that the attorney recommended. It's not accessible to anyone in this room except Arthur. You can't do that, my father said. His voice was stripped down now. Not angry, not authoritative, just exposed. A man looking at a door that had been locked before he arrived. That's family money. That money was supposed to... Supposed to what? My grandmother said. According to whom? He didn't answer, because there was no answer. There had never been a document. There had never been a meeting with an attorney or a conversation with Harold that had been recorded or witnessed. There had been an assumption. A confident, unexamined assumption, the kind that persists because no one has ever challenged it. Harold had anticipated exactly this. The fourth document was one I hadn't known about. It was a letter, handwritten, on the personal stationery my grandfather had used for his entire adult life. Cream-colored paper, his name and contractor's license number printed at the top, dated 14 months before his death. Witnessed by 2 signatures I didn't recognize and notarized. My grandmother read it aloud. Harold's voice in his handwriting was different from how I remembered his speaking voice. More formal, more deliberate. The voice of a man who understood that some things needed to outlast the moment of their saying. He wrote about Arthur, about me in specific terms. He wrote about watching me work. About the lawn mowing jobs at 12, the paper route at 14, the way I'd saved for 3 months to buy my first set of drafting tools because I decided I wanted to learn technical drawing. He wrote, "This boy has never been given anything and has never waited to be given anything. He is what I tried to be." He wrote about Julian, more briefly, without cruelty but without illusion. He wrote about Richard. "My son has a talent for acquiring what others have built and calling it his own legacy. I love him. I do not trust him with what I've made." And he wrote, near the end of the letter, a single sentence that I have since memorized. "The purpose of this arrangement is not punishment. It is correction. The family has been out of balance for a long time. This is how I am setting it right from wherever I end up." The room was silent when she finished. Julian was the first one to speak. He said, "This is insane. This is actually insane. Arthur, you engineered this." "Julian." My voice was low. "I was unconscious for 3 days." He stopped. "I didn't know any of this," I said. "Not the specifics. Not the accounts, not the land sale." I looked at him steadily. "I found out when you did. Then he pointed at my grandmother, "executed the wishes of her late husband," I said, "as she was legally appointed to do, 7 years ago." Silence. My father had not moved from his chair. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees, looking at the floor between his feet. The tan on his face that had looked healthy in the vacation photographs looked, under the ICU fluorescence, like a costume he'd forgotten to remove. He looked, for the first time in my memory, like a man who was aware that other people could see him. He looked up. "Arthur." His voice was stripped of everything I associated with it. The command, the dismissal, the practiced authority of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. What was left underneath was something older and smaller. "You're my son. Whatever has happened, whatever the paperwork says, you're my son. We're blood. You can't let this happen to us." Helena's family stole my medication money, I said. He blinked. "You went into my savings account without asking," I said. "You took $2,500 that I had been saving since I was 16 years old. You used it to put a deposit on a yacht, while I was rationing my heart medication, while your son, your blood, was working 3 jobs and eating markdown bread and trying to stay alive long enough to finish a degree." I kept my voice level. "You cut my health insurance because I wouldn't drive 600 miles to move Julian's furniture 10 days before my cardiac surgery. Level. You sent 41 text messages while I was in the ICU. Not one of them asked how I was." Level. The doctors called 45 times. Level. You were posting photographs. I let that sit. "I am not your son," I said. "I am the owner of the land your house is built on, and you have 26 days. My father stood up slowly. The movement of a man whose body is registering something his mind hasn't fully processed yet. He crossed toward me. Not with anger. That was the thing I hadn't expected. I had prepared myself for the anger, for the version of my father who managed difficulty through volume and intimidation. That version didn't come. What came instead was worse in its way. He stopped 2 feet from my bed. His hands were loose at his sides. The sun had burned a faint line across the back of his neck, where the collar of his resort shirt ended. He was 61 years old, and in that fluorescent light, every year of it was visible. "Arthur," he said, "just my name." There was something in it that reached for the version of me that had wanted, for 23 years, for that voice to come with warmth behind it. Boys learn very early whether their father's voice is a place of safety. I had learned very early that mine wasn't, and I had built myself accordingly. But the echo of the want was still there. I acknowledged it. I did not act on it. "You stole my medication," I said. "You left me without insurance. You let 45 calls go to voicemail while I was in surgery." He said nothing. "I have a letter," I said, "from a man who understood what that meant, who understood it 7 years ago. That's the man who built what you've been living off. Not you." My father's jaw worked. "I need you to leave," I said. "I'll have the hospital security escort you if you'd prefer that." He stood there for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked out. Julian went without being asked, not with dignity, but with the stunned mechanical movement of someone whose operating assumptions had just been removed. He walked out with his hands still in his pockets, his resort tan face blank in a way that I suspected was new to it. My mother stood last. She looked at me with an expression I didn't have a name for. Not guilt. I don't think guilt was available to her in that quantity. Something closer to disorientation. She had built her entire identity on a particular version of the Mitchell family, and she had just watched the load-bearing structure of it removed. She opened her mouth. I said, "Goodbye, Beatrice." She left. The door closed. The room returned to its baseline sounds, the monitor, the ventilation system, the distant professional activity of a hospital floor going about its business. My grandmother removed her reading glasses. She folded them. She placed them in the case in her cardigan pocket. "You did well," she said. I exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that carries more than carbon dioxide. "I don't feel good about it," I said. "That's because you're not built for cruelty," she said. "What you did wasn't cruel. There's a difference." I thought about that. "He's still my father," I said. "Yes," she said. "He is. And he made choices that a father doesn't make." She was quiet for a moment. "Harold made me promise something before he died. He made me promise I wouldn't step in early. that I'd let the pattern establish itself clearly enough that there was no ambiguity. He said, "Martha, a man who'll steal from his own son to fund a party will do it twice if you catch him at one and let him walk." She looked at the door. "He did it twice," she said. "Several more times than that, actually. The records are very thorough." I lay back against the pillow. Outside the window, the sky had gone fully dark. The lights of the city were beginning to come up. That particular American nightscape of strip mall signs and highway interchange glow that I'd looked at my whole life and never thought twice about. I thought about London. My grandmother opened the envelope one final time and removed a piece of paper I hadn't seen yet. It was printed on university letterhead. University of Oxford. Department of Engineering Science. The paper had a formality to it that American academic correspondence rarely manages. Something about the weight of the stock, the precise placement of the crest. My grandmother had received it on my behalf at her address. The address I'd listed as my permanent residence since my sophomore year, because I'd learned early that mail sent to my parents' house had a way of not reaching me with its contents intact. It was a full scholarship offer. Master of Science, Structural Engineering. Starting the following September. The letter noted my academic record, cited my capstone project specifically, a seismic resilience analysis for aging bridge infrastructure in earthquake-prone urban zones, and extended what it called an exceptional merit award covering full tuition, housing stipend, and a research fellowship attachment at the department of their cardiovascular medicine partner institution. The Cardiovascular Medicine Partner Institution. I read that line twice. "The hospital is a 15-minute walk from Balliol College," my grandmother said. I checked on a map. "I am thorough." I looked at her. "When did you—" "I forwarded your thesis to 3 institutions last spring," she said, without any particular drama. "I had been reading your work for 2 years. I understood it well enough to know it was worth sending. Your grandfather was a structural engineer by trade, if not by credential. I grew up with the vocabulary." I held the letter. My grandfather had read load diagrams at the kitchen table. My grandmother had learned the language over 50 years of marriage to him. She had taken that language and used it to send my work to Oxford. I set the letter down on the blanket. "Grandma," I said, "Arthur, I want you to come with me." She had the expression of someone who had been waiting to hear those words and had prepared an answer. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said. "I've already looked into a small flat near the university. I have certain views about English gardens that I've been waiting for an opportunity to investigate in person." I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in, I didn't know how long. It hurt my chest, which had been operated on 4 days ago, and I didn't care. My grandmother smiled. Not the wide, performative smile of someone who wants you to see them smiling. The small, precise smile of someone who is actually satisfied. "The trust provides adequately for both of us," she said. "Your grandfather was, above all things, thorough." I thought about Harold Mitchell, a man I had known until I was 16, who had sat across from me at kitchen tables and corrected my arithmetic and never once, in my memory, said anything that he didn't mean. A man who had gone into a lawyer's office years before his death and written, with his own hand, a correction to a family imbalance he had calculated with the precision of a structural engineer accounting for every load. He had known I would need it. He had made sure it would be there. I held the Oxford letter and looked at the city lights outside the window and thought about how far away from this parking lot nightscape a person could get, if they had saved carefully and built honestly and been loved, quietly and practically, by one person who saw clearly. Pretty far, it turned out. Pretty far. The apartment is on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian terrace house on a street called Cat Street, which I find endlessly pleasing because my grandmother has informed me it has nothing to do with cats, which she considers a missed opportunity on the part of the city planners. The windows look out on a courtyard. In the mornings, there is actual mist, the rolling, soft English mist that seems like something out of a film until you live inside it and it becomes just the weather. My grandmother has established a working relationship with the woman at the flower stall on the corner, whose name is Margaret, and they discuss chrysanthemums with the focused intensity of 2 people who have both reached the age where they are no longer willing to discuss things that don't matter. My heart is steady. Dr. Ewan connected me with a cardiologist at the Oxford Partner Hospital, A man named Dr. Patel who has the measured precision of someone who has been asked every possible question and has found the accurate answer to all of them. Under his care, with consistent medication and actual sleep and food that I didn't source from a markdown rack, the arrhythmia has responded exactly as it was supposed to respond when given what it needed. I am a student again. A different kind this time. The work at Oxford has a weight to it, a density, the kind of intellectual pressure that doesn't exhaust you the way 3 jobs do, but builds something instead. My thesis is on resilience engineering for aging infrastructure in high seismic zones. My supervisor is a small, exacting Welsh woman named Dr. Griffiths who has never once complimented my work but has also never suggested that any of it was wrong, which I've come to understand is her version of approval. I am, for the first time in my adult life, exactly where I'm supposed to be. In January, a distant cousin named Diane sent me an email. She had always been fair, Diane, one of those family-adjacent people who witnesses the situation clearly and chooses, at some point, to just tell you what they saw. She wrote to tell me that Julian's wedding had been called off. Helena's father had learned, through the practical mechanism of bounce checks and credit inquiries, that the Mitchell family's financial standing was not what had been represented. He was a man who had spent his career in politics, which means he was a man with a specific and well-developed sensitivity to misrepresentation. The engagement dissolved within a week of the first inquiry. Julian had sold the custom wedding suit. Not the watch had gone to a consignment shop 3 weeks before the suit, according to Diane, who had her sources. My father had been demoted at his firm. Something to do with a client account that had been managed imprecisely. The details were the details of a man who had been borrowing against tomorrow for so long that tomorrow had finally arrived. He was no longer the version of himself that walked into rooms like they'd been expecting him. The house on Sycamore Drive was a parking lot. Diane sent a photograph. Fresh asphalt. Clean white lines. The Meridian Commercial Development logo on a sign at the corner. My mother and father were renting an apartment on the edge of the county. She described it neutrally. I didn't ask for more. They had been sending emails. Not many. A few. The tone had changed with each one, moving through the phases of people who are accustomed to being answered and have begun to understand that they might not be. The most recent one was from my father. It was short. It contained, near the end, a sentence about financial difficulty and the hope that I might be willing to discuss an arrangement. And it closed with the word that had once been his verdict on my situation. You were always so self-sufficient, he wrote. I'm sure you understand how these things go. I read the email on a Tuesday morning, sitting in the apartment with tea going cold beside me and the mist doing its thing outside the window. I set up an auto-reply. 1 word. Self-sufficient. Then I closed the laptop, picked up my tea, and went to the window. Grandma Martha was in the courtyard below, in her good navy cardigan, speaking to Margaret about chrysanthemums. She looked up as if she sensed me there, the way she always seemed to sense where I was. She raised one hand. Small gesture. You're there. I'm here. That's enough. I raised mine back. Harold Mitchell had been a man who built things that were meant to last. He had understood, in the careful, load-bearing way of structural engineers and veterans and men who'd had to account for every variable, that the most important thing you can give a person is not money or position or a name that opens doors. It's a foundation that holds when everything else fails. He built one for me. He was right that it would be needed. And now, on the 3rd floor of a Victorian terrace house in Oxford, England, with my heart beating in its correct rhythm and my grandmother in the courtyard below, I am building on top of it. One load-bearing beam at a time. If you made it to the end of the story, you already know why I had to tell it. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in that hospital room? And if you believe that the quiet ones are usually the ones worth watching, hit subscribe. There are more stories where this one came from. Every single one of them is true.